Mark lived on the edge of a fast-growing town where new streets appeared every few months and empty fields turned into houses with fresh paint and neat lawns. His land sat right beside all that change, but it still looked like the old days. A small house stood near a line of tall trees, and the rest of the property stretched wide with rough grass and a few storage sheds that had been there for years. Mark liked it that way. He was the kind of man who enjoyed quiet mornings and long evenings without noise from neighbors. He worked as a repairman and did jobs all across town. Some days he fixed water lines, some days he repaired fences, and other days he helped older people with small home issues. People liked him because he was honest and did not talk too much. Mark did not try to impress anyone. He just wanted to pay his bills, keep his land, and stay out of trouble. That is why the envelope at his gate felt so strange. It was early in the morning when he noticed it. The sun was still low and the air was cold. Mark walked toward the gate to check his mailbox and saw a thick white envelope clipped to the metal bars. It had a bright logo on the front and bold words that made him pause. Homeowners Association Notice. Mark frowned. He had heard about these groups from other people. They were known for rules about lawns, paint colors, noise, and fences. Mark had never joined any group like that. He lived on his own land. No one told him how to live. No one paid his taxes for him. No one repaired his roof. So why would anyone send him a letter with that logo? He opened the envelope while standing in the dirt road near his gate. The paper inside was crisp and the words were sharp like they were meant to scare. Mark scanned the page and then he stopped. A large number was printed in the middle. $250,000. Mark blinked and read it again to make sure he did not mix up the zeros. The letter said he was being fined for violations on his land. It listed several issues: unapproved structures, blocked access paths, failure to comply with community standards, improper storage, improper fencing. It even mentioned the look of his yard. Mark let out a short laugh because it sounded like a joke. His sheds were old, but they were on his own property. His fences were simple but strong. His yard was not a show yard and he did not want it to be. He was not living in a place with perfect grass and matching mailboxes. He was living on land his father had left him. He read the letter again with more care. At the bottom it said he had 14 days to pay, or the matter would move forward. It also mentioned legal steps and enforcement actions. There was a phone number and the name of an HOA office manager. Mark folded the paper slowly. He did not feel fear yet. He felt confusion. A fine like that could ruin someone. Even if it was a mistake, it was not a small mistake. It was the kind of mistake that could change a life. Mark went inside and made coffee, but he barely tasted it. He kept thinking about one line in the letter. It said his land was part of the neighborhood community and subject to its rules. That line did not make sense. Mark paid the taxes on this land. He had been there long before the new houses came. How could anyone claim he was part of their rules? Later that day, Mark drove into town and stopped at a small office building near the new neighborhood entrance. The sign outside said HOA Management Services. The parking lot was filled with clean cars and everything looked polished. Mark walked in wearing work boots and a plain jacket. The waiting room smelled like fresh cleaner. A receptionist looked up and smiled in a careful way. She asked how she could help. Mark placed the letter on the counter and said he received this notice and wanted to understand why. The receptionist glanced at the paper and her smile tightened. She asked him to take a seat. After a few minutes, a woman came out with a folder in her hands. She was dressed neatly and walked like she was used to being listened to. Two men followed her. They wore clean suits and carried the kind of confidence that came from thinking rules were on their side. The woman introduced herself as Helen. She said she represented the neighborhood HOA board. She spoke in a polite voice, but there was something sharp behind it. She said the neighborhood had reported ongoing issues and the board had issued fines based on their enforcement policy. Mark asked one question right away. He asked where it said he was a member of their association. Helen opened the folder and pulled out a map. She pointed to a section outlined in bold color. Mark recognized the area around his property. The new homes surrounded him now on 3 sides. A new road had been built close to his back line. Helen said the development had been planned as a community and that his parcel sat inside the boundary. Mark asked again how that made him part of their group. One of the men spoke next. His name was Tom. He said the rules applied because the area had been recorded as part of the community plan. He said the rules were meant to protect property values for everyone. He said Mark was causing problems for the neighborhood because his land looked different. Mark kept his voice calm, but his thoughts ran fast. He told them his land was not part of their neighborhood. He told them his father owned it before the first house was built. He told them he never signed anything. Helen stayed polite. She said the board was willing to discuss payment plans. She said the fines could grow if issues were not corrected. She said Mark should act quickly to avoid court. Mark looked at the map again. The lines were clean and official. The paper had stamps and numbers. It looked serious. But Mark noticed something. The map showed a path that was supposed to run through the edge of his property. Helen called it a community access route. She said Mark blocked it by placing sheds nearby. Mark asked her to show him where the path was in real life. Helen said the path was approved in the plan, and that was enough. Mark stood up and said he would not pay anything until he saw proof that his land belonged to them. He asked for copies of every document they used to claim that. Helen handed him a packet and said he could consult a lawyer if he wanted. Her voice sounded like she expected him to give up. Mark left the office and drove home in silence. As he turned onto the dirt road, he saw the new neighborhood entrance sign in the distance. It had a fancy name and a stone wall. Mark remembered when that area was nothing but open field. At home, Mark went to a small storage room and pulled out a metal box from a shelf. It was old and scratched. His father had told him to keep it safe and never throw it away. Inside were papers that Mark rarely touched. Land deeds, surveys, receipts, letters, a few faded maps rolled up with rubber bands. Mark spread everything across his table. He worked slowly, reading each page. The language was old but clear. It described boundaries using landmarks and measurements. Mark found the original deed and then the survey that came later. He compared the papers from the HOA packet with his own documents. Hours passed. The light outside turned orange and then dark. Mark kept reading. He noticed how the HOA map used new street names and clean lines. His old maps used older names and more detail. One showed a large section labeled as an easement that belonged to his family. Another mentioned a shared utility route. Another listed restrictions that were very different from what the HOA claimed. Mark leaned back and took a long breath. The truth started to form like a picture coming into focus. The HOA map made it look like Mark's land was a small piece sitting inside their neighborhood. But the older documents showed something else. They showed the neighborhood was built on land that had a complicated history. Parts had been sold. Parts had been leased. Parts had been allowed only under certain conditions. Mark found one document that made his hands go still. It was a contract from years ago, signed by a development company that no longer existed. It mentioned that if certain terms were not met, rights would return to the original landholder or their heirs. Mark read the terms carefully. He realized the HOA was not just wrong about his land. They might be wrong about the land under their own streets and homes. Mark looked around his small kitchen. The quiet house felt different now. The letter had arrived like a threat, but it had also opened a door. If he was right, then the people who tried to control him were standing on a mistake that could become their problem. Mark folded the paper and placed it on top of the HOA packet. His face stayed calm, but his eyes carried a new focus. He was not going to panic. He was going to check every line. He was going to confirm everything. And when he did, someone else might be the one feeling afraid. The next morning Mark woke before sunrise. His mind had not rested much during the night. The papers on his kitchen table stayed exactly where he left them. They felt heavier now, not in weight but in meaning. What began as a fine had turned into a question about who really owned what. Mark made a simple breakfast and sat down again with the documents. He read the contract once more, slower this time. It spoke about development rights and long-term conditions. It said that certain roads and shared areas were allowed only if the developer followed specific rules. If those rules were broken, control would return to the original landholder. Mark remembered his father talking about those agreements. His father was never loud about them. He only said that land deals were promises written on paper and that broken promises came back one day. Mark had not thought much about it then. Now those words felt clear. Mark decided not to rush. He knew panic would help no one. He needed facts. He needed confirmation. So he made a list on a notepad. He wrote down the names of offices to visit and people to speak with. The county land records office was first. Then the planning department. Then a surveyor. Later that morning Mark drove into town again. The land records building was old and plain. Inside, rows of cabinets held maps and files that stretched back decades. A clerk with glasses helped him request copies of older surveys and filings related to his land and the surrounding area. Mark waited quietly while the clerk returned with a stack of papers. Some were yellowed with age. Some had handwritten notes. Mark spread them out on a long table. He compared them to his own copies. The lines matched. The measurements matched. The notes about conditional development matched as well. One filing stood out. It showed that the developer who built the neighborhood had agreed to limits on shared land use. The agreement clearly stated that no association could claim authority over the original parcel unless a new contract was signed. Mark felt his chest loosen when he read that line. He thanked the clerk and left with copies in his folder. Next Mark went to the planning department. The building was newer and filled with posters about growth and community living. A planner met with him and listened carefully as Mark explained the fine and the claim. The planner pulled up records on a computer and studied the maps on screen. After a few minutes the planner leaned back. He said the HOA boundary looked correct on newer filings, but those filings depended on earlier approvals. He said if the original conditions were not fully met, the newer boundary could be challenged. Mark asked if those conditions had been reviewed recently. The planner shook his head. He said most people never questioned them. Developments moved fast. Files were copied from old files. Mistakes could pass through unnoticed. Mark thanked him and left again. By the time he reached home, the sun was high. Mark sat at his table and organized everything into neat piles. His land. Their land. Shared areas. Conditions. Dates. Names. He felt calm now. Not confident yet, but steady. 2 days later Mark received another letter from the HOA. This one was firmer in tone. It reminded him of the deadline. It warned him of further action. It included photos of his sheds and fences, taken from the road. The message was clear. They expected him to bend. Instead, Mark made a call. He contacted a local land attorney named Paul. Paul was not flashy. His office was small and quiet. When Mark laid out the story and the documents, Paul listened without interrupting. He asked careful questions and took notes. After reading the contract and surveys, Paul nodded slowly. He said Mark was right to question the fine. He said the HOA might have assumed control they did not legally have. He said the situation was unusual but serious. Paul explained something else that caught Mark off guard. If the HOA claimed authority over Mark's land without proper rights, they might have exposed themselves to larger problems. If the development violated original conditions, ownership of certain common areas could revert back. Mark asked what that meant in simple terms. Paul said it meant the HOA might not fully own what they thought they owned. Mark felt the weight of that idea settle in. The roads, the green spaces, the shared entrances, all of it depended on paperwork that might not hold up. Paul advised Mark to stay calm and not respond emotionally. He would draft a formal response asking the HOA to provide proof of authority under the original conditions. He would also request a pause on enforcement until the matter was reviewed. A week passed. The HOA replied with a formal letter. It rejected the request for a pause. It insisted its authority was valid. It scheduled a hearing before the board and invited Mark to attend. Mark read the letter carefully. He felt a mix of nerves and resolve. This was not a small dispute anymore. This was public. Neighbors would be watching. The hearing took place in a community hall near the neighborhood entrance. Rows of chairs filled the room. Several residents sat whispering among themselves. Some glanced at Mark with curiosity. Others looked annoyed. The board members sat at a long table at the front. Helen was there again, along with the two men. She opened the meeting and spoke about maintaining standards and fairness. She said the board had acted according to its duty. When Mark's turn came, Paul stood beside him. Paul spoke clearly and calmly. He presented the original contracts and conditions. He pointed out the clauses that limited authority. He asked the board to explain how those clauses had been satisfied. The room grew quiet. Helen glanced at the papers and then at the other board members. She said the development followed approved plans. Paul responded by asking where the final compliance report was. He asked for proof that the conditions had been fulfilled. The board members whispered among themselves. A resident in the audience raised a hand and asked what this meant for the neighborhood. Helen said the issue concerned only Mark's land. Paul corrected her gently. He said the issue concerned the basis of the HOA authority itself. That caused murmurs to spread across the room. The board decided to delay a decision. They said they needed time to review the documents. The fine was not enforced that day. Mark left the hall with mixed reactions behind him. Over the next few weeks, surveyors visited the area. They measured lines and reviewed records. The HOA hired their own experts. Mark noticed tension in the neighborhood. Meetings grew longer. Notices appeared on doors. One evening Mark received a call from Paul. Paul said the survey results were clear. The original conditions had not been fully met. Certain shared areas were built on land that was never properly transferred. Mark asked what that meant now. Paul said it meant negotiations were coming. The HOA could not ignore this. They had overreached. And in doing so, they had opened a door they could not easily close. Mark stood outside after the call and looked across the fields toward the neighborhood lights. He felt no joy in the trouble ahead. Only clarity. They had tried to control what they did not understand. And now they would have to face what the land truly said. The neighborhood changed in small ways after the hearing. It was not loud at first. It was more like a quiet shift in the air. People still washed their cars and walked their dogs, but their faces looked more serious. Mark noticed it each time he drove past the entrance sign. The stone wall looked the same, yet the feeling around it was different. The HOA had always acted like the strongest voice in the area. Now that voice sounded unsure. Mark stayed focused on facts. He did not talk to neighbors about the case. He did not post anything online. He kept doing his work and coming home to his land. He knew emotions could cause mistakes, and mistakes could turn truth into confusion. A few days after Paul shared the survey results, Mark received a new letter. This one was not a fine. It was an invitation. The HOA wanted a private meeting at their management office. The letter was polite, almost friendly. It asked Mark to attend with his attorney so they could discuss solutions. Mark showed the letter to Paul. Paul read it and gave a small nod. He said this was expected. He said the HOA likely realized their position was weak. They would try to control the situation by offering a deal. Paul advised Mark to listen, not argue, and let the documents do the speaking. The meeting happened on a Monday morning. Mark and Paul walked into the same clean office as before. The receptionist smiled too quickly. It felt like a mask. Helen greeted them in a conference room with a long table. 2 board members sat beside her. Another man sat near the end of the table with a laptop and a stack of files. He introduced himself as the HOA lawyer. His voice was calm and controlled. Helen started with a soft tone. She said the board wanted peace. She said they respected Mark's long history on his land. She said misunderstandings happen during development. She said the goal was to protect the community. Paul thanked her and said they also wanted peace. Then Paul asked a simple question. He asked if the HOA accepted the survey findings. Helen paused. She said the HOA did not agree with every detail. The lawyer spoke next. He said the documents were being reviewed. He said the HOA still believed it had authority. Paul opened his folder and slid copies of the original agreement across the table. He pointed to the clause about conditions and transfers. He pointed to the missing compliance report. He pointed to the survey notes that showed certain common areas were never properly transferred. The HOA lawyer's eyes moved across the pages. He did not react much, but his fingers tapped lightly on the table. Mark stayed quiet. He watched their faces. He noticed how Helen avoided looking straight at the contract for too long. She looked more worried than she wanted to appear. The lawyer cleared his throat. He said the HOA was willing to settle. He said they could reduce the fine to 0 and remove all violation claims. He said they would also offer Mark a special agreement that would make him a member with certain benefits, like access to community services. Mark almost smiled. It sounded like they were offering him permission to live on his own land. Paul answered for Mark. Paul said they were not there to ask for favors. They were there because the HOA threatened an illegal fine. Paul said the main issue was not the fine anymore. The main issue was the HOA claiming control it did not have. The room fell quiet for a moment. Helen tried again. She said maybe they could adjust boundaries. She said maybe Mark's parcel could be excluded while the rest of the community stayed the same. Paul leaned forward and said it was not that simple. If the HOA was built on incorrect land transfers, it was not only about Mark's parcel. It involved the entrance, the shared green areas, and several roads. If those areas were never properly transferred, then ownership could revert. The HOA lawyer asked one direct question. He asked who would that land revert to. Paul looked at Mark and then back at the lawyer. Paul said according to the original agreement, it could revert to the original landholder or heirs. Mark was the heir. Helen's face tightened. One of the board members whispered something under his breath. Mark finally spoke. His voice was calm. He said he never wanted to control their neighborhood. He said he wanted to live quietly. He said they came to him with threats, not respect. He said he did not start this, but he would finish it properly. The lawyer nodded slowly. He said they would need time. He said the board would review options and contact them again. Mark and Paul left without signing anything. Outside, Mark felt the cold air hit his face. He did not feel proud. He felt careful. He understood this could still become messy. Even if the truth was on his side, people could still fight when they felt cornered. Over the next week, the HOA sent a notice to residents saying there was a legal boundary issue under review. The notice tried to sound calm. It said daily operations would continue. It asked residents not to worry. But the notice made the worry louder. Residents began asking questions at meetings. Some blamed Mark. Some blamed the HOA. Some blamed the developer. Rumors spread that property values could drop. Rumors spread that roads might not be maintained. Rumors spread that people could lose access to certain services. Mark kept away from all that talk. He stayed home and met only with Paul and the surveyor. One afternoon, Two older residents came to Mark's gate. They introduced themselves as Sam and Nora. They lived in the neighborhood and wanted to speak peacefully. Mark let them stand inside the gate, but he did not invite them deep into his land. He wanted to stay respectful but careful. Sam said many people were scared. He said they did not understand what was happening. He said some thought Mark was trying to take their homes. Mark shook his head. He said he had no interest in their houses. He said his issue was with the HOA leadership and the way they threatened him. He said if the HOA had come with respect, they could have talked quietly from the start. Nora asked what Mark wanted now. Mark thought for a moment. He said he wanted fairness. He said he wanted his land left alone. He said he wanted clear boundaries. He said he wanted the HOA to stop acting like it could punish people without proper authority. Sam nodded. He said that sounded reasonable. Before they left, Mark gave them one piece of advice. He told them to request the full history of the land transfers from the board. He told them to ask questions calmly and demand clear answers. After they left, Mark felt something change again. The fear in the neighborhood was turning into curiosity. People wanted to know the truth. 2 days later, Paul called Mark with major news. He said the developer company that built the neighborhood had missed a key requirement years ago. They were supposed to file a final transfer document after completing certain infrastructure conditions. They never did. The missing paper meant the HOA's claim over the common areas was weak. Mark asked what came next. Paul said the HOA now faced a choice. They could fight and risk losing control of major shared land. Or they could negotiate and accept a new agreement that respected Mark's rights. That evening Mark sat at his kitchen table again and looked at the original maps. He traced the boundary line with his finger. He realized something important. If the common areas reverted, he would not just own a small piece of land beside the neighborhood. He could end up owning the entrance roads and shared land that connected the whole place. Not the homes, but the ground that held their neighborhood together. Mark knew that kind of power could be dangerous if used the wrong way. He did not want revenge. He did not want to scare families. He wanted a clear and fair solution. But he also knew the HOA had pushed too far. And now, they were about to learn what happens when someone threatens the wrong person. Because Mark was not trapped inside their neighborhood. Their neighborhood was built around his. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread fast, and even people who never attended meetings before showed up. The community hall felt tighter than usual. Chairs were pulled close. Some people stood along the walls. Voices stayed low, but the worry was clear in every face. Helen sat at the front table with the other board members. The HOA lawyer was there too. They tried to look calm, but they kept glancing at the crowd as if they expected a storm of questions. Mark did not attend. Paul advised him to stay away unless invited officially. Mark understood. The more he stayed quiet, the more the documents spoke for him. Still, Mark wanted to know what was being said. Sam and Nora promised to share what happened. That night, Sam called Mark. His voice sounded tired. Sam said the meeting started with Helen reading a prepared statement. She said the HOA was handling a technical land matter. She said the community services would continue. She said there was no reason to panic. She said rumors were harmful. Then residents began asking questions anyway. One man asked why the HOA fined Mark such a huge amount without confirming authority. A woman asked why there were missing transfer papers. Another resident asked if the HOA had been collecting fees and making rules on land it might not fully control. The lawyer answered many questions with careful words. He said things were under review. He said certain documents were still being located. He said legal matters could not be discussed in detail. Each answer sounded polite, but it did not calm anyone. Sam said one moment stood out. A resident asked if Mark could shut down the neighborhood entrance if he wanted. The hall became silent after that. Helen quickly said no, that was not true. But she did not sound sure. Mark listened quietly to Sam on the phone. When the call ended, Mark walked outside and stared toward the neighborhood lights again. He could feel the pressure building, even though he was not in the room. People were scared because they did not know the truth. Fear grows fastest when answers are hidden. The next day, Paul called with an update. The HOA lawyer had reached out again. This time the tone was different. They wanted another meeting. They also wanted to include a representative from the original developer's legal side, if any could be located through the old records. Paul said this was a sign the HOA was trying to protect itself. Mark agreed to the meeting. It took place in a larger office downtown. A long glass table sat in the center of the room. Mark and Paul arrived first. Soon Helen entered with the HOA lawyer and 2 board members. Then a new man arrived, older, wearing a simple suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Reed. He said he worked with a company that had purchased some old legal responsibilities tied to the developer's previous business matters. Mark watched Mr. Reed closely. He did not look like someone who enjoyed conflict. He looked like someone who cleaned up problems. Paul opened the meeting. He laid out the main facts again. He showed the missing compliance document. He showed the survey findings. He explained the original contract conditions. He said the HOA could not claim authority over Mark's land. He also said the HOA's authority over certain common areas was not properly supported. The HOA lawyer responded by saying the neighborhood had existed for years and that residents relied on the HOA for services. He said sudden changes could cause harm. Paul replied that harm had already been caused by wrongful threats and fines. Helen tried to speak about community standards and property value. Mark listened for a while and then spoke calmly. He told them he never asked to be part of their system. He told them he respected families who lived there, but he would not allow any group to punish him without legal right. He said he wanted a clear agreement and a fair end. Mr. Reed finally spoke. He said the missing compliance report was real. He said based on the files he could access, the developer did fail to complete a final filing step. He said mistakes like that happen when companies close and people move on. He said it was not a small mistake, though. It affected the legal chain. The HOA lawyer asked if the issue could be fixed now with a new filing. Mr. Reed said it might be possible, but only if the original landholder agreed. He looked at Mark when he said that. Helen leaned forward slightly. Her voice became softer. She asked Mark what he wanted. Mark took a slow breath. He had thought about this all week. He wanted to protect himself without turning families into enemies. He wanted to stop the HOA from acting like a power that could crush anyone. He wanted the neighborhood to be stable, but he wanted it stable in a fair way. Mark said he wanted 4 things. First, the HOA would remove the fines and violation claims fully and publicly. Second, the HOA would sign a statement confirming they had no authority over Mark's land and would not contact him again unless invited. Third, a new boundary agreement would be created for common areas so no one could pretend the rules applied everywhere. Fourth, the HOA would pay the legal and survey costs Mark faced because of their threats. The board members looked at each other. One of them whispered to Helen. The HOA lawyer said the last point might be difficult. He said the board would not want to admit fault. Paul responded calmly that admitting fault was not required, but making Mark whole was required. He said the HOA created this situation. Mark did not. Mr. Reed suggested another idea. He said the neighborhood needed a stable solution. He said Mark had rights that could not be ignored. He said the HOA needed the entrance roads and shared land to stay functional. He said instead of fighting, they could create a long-term easement and service agreement. The HOA could pay a fair fee for use and maintenance rights, and Mark could agree not to interfere as long as terms were honored. Helen looked uncomfortable. The idea that the HOA would pay Mark felt like defeat. But the longer the issue remained open, the more residents would lose trust in the board. The meeting ended without a final agreement, but it was closer than before. Both sides promised to exchange written proposals in the next few days. When Mark left the office, he felt tired but also relieved. The truth was no longer hidden. It sat in the open, on paper, in front of everyone. A few days later, residents began showing up at Mark's gate again, one by one. Not to threaten him. To ask questions. To understand. Some were polite. Some were nervous. Mark stayed respectful. He explained the simple parts. He said he was not trying to take homes. He said he wanted fairness. He said the HOA made a mistake and tried to cover it with pressure. One woman named Mia stood at the gate holding her phone tightly. She said she was a new mother and she worried about stability. She asked if Mark would ever block the entrance. Mark told her no. He said he would never do that to families. He said he wanted peace. Mia looked relieved. She thanked him and walked away. That evening Sam and Nora came again. Sam said the neighborhood was changing sides. More residents were questioning the board. People wanted accountability. They wanted rules that made sense. They wanted leaders who did not use threats as tools. Mark stood there listening, feeling the cool air on his face. The fine that once felt like a giant rock on his chest now felt like something else. It felt like a lesson for the whole neighborhood. When power is used without care, it breaks trust. And when trust breaks, even the strongest group can fall. Mark knew part 5 would be the hardest. Because now it was not just about winning. It was about ending it in a way that stayed fair, stable, and human. The final week of talks felt like walking on thin glass. One wrong step could turn the whole situation into a long fight. Mark could feel it in every phone call and every letter that arrived. The HOA was no longer acting confident. They were acting careful, like people who realized they had been standing on weak ground for years. Paul told Mark that the board had split into two sides. One side wanted to settle quickly and quietly. They feared the residents would remove them from leadership. The other side wanted to fight because they did not want to look wrong. They believed backing down would make the HOA look weak. Mark did not care about their pride. He cared about safety and fairness. He wanted his land left alone, and he wanted the neighborhood to stop living under fear and threats. He also wanted to protect himself from future problems. A peaceful ending was the goal, but a strong agreement was the shield. On Tuesday, Paul received the HOA proposal. It was written in official language, full of careful wording. The board offered to remove the fines and close the violation case. They also offered to exclude Mark's parcel from HOA rules. They wanted Mark to sign a promise not to interfere with any community roads or shared areas. Paul read it and made notes. Then he called Mark. Paul said the offer was close, but it had a problem. The HOA wanted protection without taking responsibility. They wanted Mark to give peace guarantees while they paid nothing for the trouble they caused. They also wanted wide access rights over parts of land that might revert back to Mark. Mark listened and then said they needed balance. If the HOA wanted stable access, they should pay a fair fee for it. If they wanted Mark's cooperation, they should treat him with respect, not like someone they could crush. Paul agreed. He prepared a counter-proposal. The counter-proposal included everything Mark asked for. Full removal of fines and violations. A public board statement that the HOA had no authority over Mark's land. A formal boundary correction. Payment of legal and survey costs. And a long-term easement agreement for the shared entrance and maintenance access with a fair yearly fee. The easement would protect residents from sudden change, and it would protect Mark from future overreach. The HOA responded 2 days later. They asked for another meeting. This time they wanted residents present as observers. They said transparency mattered now. The meeting took place at the community hall again. The room filled quickly, but the mood was different from before. People looked less like a crowd and more like a community trying to understand a hard truth. Some were still upset. Some were calm but watchful. Many were simply tired of uncertainty. Mark arrived with Paul. He walked in quietly and took a seat near the front. He did not dress fancy. He wore clean, simple clothes and carried a folder. People turned their heads to look at him. A few faces showed suspicion. A few showed relief. Helen opened the meeting. She spoke more slowly than usual. She admitted the board had acted too fast when it fined Mark. She said they believed they had authority, but they now understood there were gaps in the records. She did not say the board was wrong in every way, but she did not sound proud either. Paul stood next and explained the facts in plain words. He said Mark's land was never part of the HOA. He said the fine had no legal base. He also explained the missing transfer document and why it mattered. He kept it simple. He did not try to scare anyone. He said the goal was stability for residents and fairness for Mark. Then Mark spoke. He said he understood why families were worried. He said he was not their enemy. He said he never wanted control over their homes. He said the only reason he pushed back was because the HOA tried to punish him with a massive fine and threats. He said if any person was treated that way, they would fight back too. Mark paused and looked around the room. He said he did not want revenge. He said he wanted respect and clear boundaries. He said he was willing to sign a long-term easement so the entrance roads and shared areas would stay open and protected. He said he would never block the neighborhood as long as the agreement was honored. He said he only asked that the HOA stop using fear as a tool. The room stayed quiet. People listened. A resident stood up and asked a direct question. She asked if Mark really owned their entire neighborhood. Mark shook his head. He said no. He said the homes were owned by the families who lived in them. He said the issue was about common areas and certain land transfers tied to the entrance and shared spaces. He said the HOA had acted like it owned everything, but the paperwork did not fully support that. Another resident asked why the HOA did not catch the missing document years ago. Mr. Reed stood up from the side of the room. He explained how companies change hands, files get copied, and mistakes get missed. He said it was not an excuse, but it was common. He said what mattered was fixing it correctly now. Helen then surprised everyone. She said the board would accept most of Mark's terms. She said they would remove the fines and all violation claims. She said they would sign a statement confirming no authority over Mark's parcel. She said they would correct the boundaries. She said they would agree to the easement. The only issue was costs. The board wanted to pay part of the legal and survey costs, not all. They claimed the board acted based on what they believed at the time. Paul replied that belief does not erase harm. Mark was forced to hire help to defend his rights. Paul said if the board wanted trust back, they should take full responsibility for the damage done. Residents began murmuring again. This time the murmurs sounded different. People were not angry at Mark. They were questioning the board. They were asking each other why the HOA could charge fees and fines so freely but hesitate to pay back what they caused. Sam stood up and spoke calmly. He said he had lived there since the first year. He said the HOA often acted like a warning sign, not like a service. He said this situation proved that power without checks can go wrong. He said the board should pay Mark fully and move forward with a better system. More residents nodded. Some clapped softly. Helen looked down at her notes. She took a slow breath and then said the board would accept full costs. She said the board would also propose new rules requiring extra review before any large fines could be issued. She said residents would have more oversight. That moment changed the room. People exhaled like they had been holding air for weeks. Paul and the HOA lawyer agreed to finalize the written agreement. The documents would be signed within days. The board would issue a public notice removing the fine and clearing Mark's record. The easement would be filed properly. Mark would receive payment for costs and a fair yearly fee for the easement use. The HOA would remain in place, but its limits would be clear. When the meeting ended, people approached Mark. Some apologized for assuming the worst. Some thanked him for staying calm. Some just wanted to shake his hand. Mark did not act proud. He acted steady. He said he hoped everyone could go back to normal life now. A week later the public notice was posted. The fine was officially removed. The board statement confirmed the HOA had no authority over Mark's land. The boundary corrections were recorded. The easement agreement was filed. The neighborhood entrance remained open and protected. Residents stopped worrying about sudden changes. Mark returned to his quiet routines. One evening Mark stood near his gate and watched children ride bikes along the sidewalk near the entrance. The stone sign still stood tall, but now it felt like a normal sign, not a warning. Mark went back inside and placed the signed documents into the metal box. He closed it gently and set it back on the shelf. He realized something his father once knew. Land does tell the truth. But it only helps the person who is willing to read it carefully and stand calmly when others try to rewrite it.